Cozy Tales Collective, where dreams begin and worries fade. Welcome, dear listener. It's time to rest, to let go of the day, and to embrace deep relaxation. Take a slow, deep breath in and exhale gently. Feel the weight of your body sink into your bed, as if you are floating on a soft, drifting cloud. Let the tension melt away. Your forehead softens, your shoulders relax, your breath slows. Now imagine yourself carried by a gentle breeze, drifting toward a peaceful night's sleep. Let your thoughts fade into the background as we begin our bedtime story. The Midnight Bookshop. The moon hung low over the quiet streets, casting pale light onto the cobbled alleyways. The travelers' boots scraped against the uneven stones as they pulled their coat tighter against the late autumn chill. They had been walking for hours, their limbs heavy with exhaustion, when they spotted a dim glow ahead. A single flickering lantern swaying above an old wooden sign. Meredith's Midnight Bookshop. The traveler frowned. They had passed through this town before, but they had never noticed the bookshop. The buildings along this street were familiar, an inn with cracked shutters, a bakery that smelled of warm bread. But this particular storefront was new, or perhaps long forgotten. A soft chime rang as they pushed open the door. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and candle wax. Bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, their spines worn and gilded, their pages whispering in the stillness. The traveler hesitated before stepping inside, feeling as though they had just crossed an invisible threshold. "Ah," a voice called from the shadows, smooth and knowing. "A seeker." The traveler turned sharply to find an elderly woman watching them from behind a polished oak counter. Her silver hair was pinned in an elegant coil, her fingers adorned with rings that glimmered like captured starlight. Her eyes, deep, knowing, regarded the traveler with quiet amusement. "Come," she beckoned. "You are expected." "Expected?" the traveler echoed, their voice hoarse from disuse. The woman simply smiled and gestured toward a long wooden table in the center of the shop. Upon it lay a single book, its deep blue cover embossed with silver filigree. The traveler's breath caught. There on the spine was their name. Tentatively they reached out, their fingers tracing the intricate lettering. The book was heavier than it looked, its leather cover cool beneath their touch. When they opened it, their pulse quickened. The first page was blank, so was the second. But as they turned to the third, words began to appear, ink curling across the parchment like smoke. The traveler stood in a bookshop at midnight, reading words that should not yet exist. They inhaled sharply and glanced around the room. The woman, Meredith, watched them with quiet patience, as though she had seen this scene unfold 1,000 times before. "This is impossible," the traveler murmured. "How is this happening?" "The book tells your story," Meredith said simply. "Not the past, nor the present, only what is to come." The traveler's mouth was dry. They turned the page. With each word they read, the traveler felt a weight settle in their chest. They did not yet know what was written, but they sensed that once the story began, there would be no turning back. Their hands trembled. The ink was still moving, shaping the next chapter of their life in real time. They hesitated, torn between curiosity and fear. "Does the book always tell the truth?" they asked. Meredith tilted her head. "It tells the truth." The distinction sent a shiver down the traveler's spine. They turned another page. Ahead, the traveler would face a choice. One door would lead them to the life they had long sought, though at great cost. The other, well, some doors are meant to remain closed. The traveler's throat tightened. "What choice?" they demanded, their voice unsteady. Meredith gestured toward the far end of the shop, where a door they hadn't noticed before stood ajar. A cold draft seeped through the crack, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and something older, something forgotten. "No one stumbles upon this bookshop by accident," Meredith said softly, "and no one leaves unchanged." The traveler clenched their fists. They had been wandering for so long, seeking something they could never quite name. A purpose, a path. Perhaps at last this book held the answer, but at what cost? They turned one more page. The traveler stepped forward, heart pounding, and reached for the door. Their breath caught. Their own hand was already outstretched. The ink had written their decision before they had even made it. A part of them wanted to shut the book, to run. But another part, some deep aching part of their soul, knew that they had been waiting for this moment all their life. The door creaked as they pushed it open. Beyond, the world was waiting. Chapter 2. The Door Beyond the Pages. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a corridor shrouded in shifting shadows. The traveler hesitated at the threshold, gripping the book tightly in their hands. The air beyond the door carried a scent unlike anything in the bookshop. Earthy, damp, and tinged with something metallic, like rain on iron. Meredith remained silent behind them, her presence a steady weight in the room. The traveler swallowed hard and stepped forward. The moment their foot crossed the threshold, the candlelight from the bookshop flickered and dimmed. A rush of air, cold and ancient, swept through the corridor, pulling them in. The door slammed shut behind them. Darkness swallowed them whole. For a moment they stood frozen, heart hammering in their chest. The book still rested in their hands, and as their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they saw that the pages were shifting again. Ink curled across the parchment, forming the next passage. The traveler walked forward, drawn by a light that flickered just beyond sight. A soft glow pulsed ahead. The traveler inhaled shakily and took another step. The corridor stretched on, twisting in ways that defied reason. The walls seemed to breathe, shifting between smooth stone and wooden panels, as if the path itself was unsure of its own form. The traveler ran their fingers along the nearest wall, half expecting it to ripple beneath their touch. But it was solid, firm. The glow ahead brightened, and soon they could make out a large arched doorway at the end of the corridor. The book's pages shifted again. Beyond the archway, the traveler would find what they had always sought. But first, they would have to remember what it was. They frowned. What they had always sought. For as long as they could remember, they had been searching, wandering from place to place, never quite sure what they were looking for. The book had claimed they would have to make a choice, but how could they choose if they didn't even know what they wanted? With a deep breath, they stepped through the archway. The space beyond was vast, stretching farther than should have been possible. Massive bookshelves lined the circular walls, spiraling upward into darkness. In the center of the room, a single table stood, and upon it lay an open book identical to the one in the traveler's hands. As they approached, the words on the book's pages shimmered and rearranged themselves. "Do you remember yet?" A shiver ran down their spine. "Remember what?" they whispered. Their own book warmed in their hands. They glanced down at it, watching as new words formed. A name, a place, a promise. The traveler's head ached. There was something there, something just beyond reach. They stepped closer to the table, drawn to the second book. When they placed their hand on the page, the ink bled outward, revealing a memory. A child, standing beneath an ancient tree. A storm rolling in over distant hills. A voice whispering a promise, one they had made long ago but could no longer recall. The traveler gasped and stumbled back. The images faded, but the weight of them remained. They had been here before. Not in this bookshop, not in this corridor, but in this moment. The realization struck deep. The midnight bookshop wasn't just a place. It was a cycle, a return. This was not the first time they had opened the book with their name on it, and yet they could not remember what had come before. Their fingers tightened around the book's cover. The ink shifted again. This time you must choose differently. Their pulse pounded in their ears. What had they chosen before? What mistake had they made? Across the room, a second door appeared, its frame twisting into existence. Unlike the first, this one was carved from dark wood, with symbols etched along the edges, symbols the traveler recognized but could not read. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the floor beneath their feet. The book in their hands grew heavier, as though urging them forward. They took a shaky step toward the door. As they reached for the handle, a voice stopped them. "You should not be here." The traveler spun around. A figure stood near the bookshelves, half shrouded in shadow. They were tall, draped in a long coat that seemed to shift between fabric and mist. Their face was obscured by a hood, but their presence was undeniable, weighty, ancient, knowing. "Who are you?" the traveler asked, voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted their head. "The better question is, who are you?" The traveler's grip on the book tightened. "I don't know." "Not yet," the figure said, stepping forward. "But you will." They gestured toward the door. "You have been here before. You have chosen before. And every time, you return." The traveler's throat went dry. "Why?" The figure exhaled slowly. "Because you have forgotten what you seek." The traveler's heartbeat thundered in their ears. The book had told them as much. A name, a place, a promise. But the pieces refused to come together. The figure reached out, placing a gloved hand over the book in the traveler's grasp. The ink on the pages began to shift once more. "One door will take you forward, the other will return you to the beginning." The traveler's breath hitched. "Which is which?" The figure's hand withdrew. That is for you to decide. A sharp pulse of frustration flared in the traveler's chest. Why can't you just tell me? The figure was silent for a long moment. Then they said, because the truth is something you must claim, not something you can be given. The traveler turned back to the door. It loomed before them, waiting. Their fingers brushed the handle, cool and solid beneath their touch. Somewhere deep inside, a memory stirred, a choice, a mistake, a cycle. Was that it? Had they always chosen wrong? They closed their eyes, inhaled, and listened. The book in their hands was silent now, its pages still. The answer was not written. It was within them, and at last they understood. With steady hands they turned the handle and stepped through the door. The moment they crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The scent of parchment and candle wax returned, wrapping around them like an old embrace. They opened their eyes and found themselves standing once more in Meredith's bookshop. The book was still in their hands, but this time the final page was written. The traveler made the right choice. This time they remembered. Meredith stood behind the counter, watching them with knowing eyes. A small smile tugged at her lips. Welcome back. The traveler exhaled, the weight in their chest lifting. They weren't lost anymore. They remembered, and this time they would not forget. Chapter 3. The Book of Names. The traveler stood in Meredith's bookshop, gripping the heavy tome that had rewritten their fate. The final words still shimmered on the last page. The traveler made the right choice. This time they remembered. But what had they remembered? A whisper of a memory flickered in their mind. An ancient tree, a storm on the horizon, a voice making a promise. But the details were slippery, dissolving the moment they tried to grasp them. Meredith, ever patient, watched them with an amused glint in her eyes. You look as if you expected all the answers to be waiting for you. The traveler swallowed. Did I not make the right choice? You did. Meredith gestured toward the book in their hands. But every answer leads to a new question. You should know that by now. Frustration simmered beneath the traveler's skin. Then tell me, what did I remember? Meredith chuckled softly, moving toward the nearest bookshelf. I could, she said, running her fingers along the spines of the books. But would you believe me? Or would you only believe it if you saw it for yourself? The traveler hesitated. The words in the book had already dictated their steps, predicting every movement, every decision. But now, for the first time, the ink had gone still. No more chapters were appearing. The story was unfinished, and now the choice was truly theirs. They looked back at Meredith. How do I see it for myself? Meredith withdrew a small, leather-bound book from the shelf. Unlike the tome in the traveler's hands, this one was simple, unmarked. She placed it on the counter and slid it toward them. You must find the Book of Names. The traveler frowned. What is it? Meredith's expression grew serious. A book much like yours, but instead of telling your story, it tells the stories of those who have come before you. A chill ran down the traveler's spine. Who came before me? Meredith's lips curved into a knowing smile. Open it. The traveler hesitated before flipping open the cover of the leather-bound book. The first page was blank. Then ink began to form. Once there was another traveler who walked these halls. They too sought the truth. They too were given a choice. The words sent a shiver through them. "Another traveler?" they whispered. Meredith nodded. "Many have come before you, and not all have made the right choice." The traveler turned the page. More words bled into existence. But one name was forgotten. One name was lost to time. Their heartbeat quickened. One name was yours. They inhaled sharply. "Mine?" Meredith nodded. "You did not just lose your way, traveler. You lost your name." The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in. The traveler ran a hand through their hair, mind racing. A name, a promise, a past erased. The bookshop, the corridor, the choices. It was all part of something much larger than they had realized. They hadn't merely been lost, they had been erased. Their voice came out hoarse. "How do I find it?" Meredith gestured toward the back of the bookshop. The traveler turned, and once again a door had appeared where there had been none before. This one was unlike the others. It was neither wooden nor metal, but made of something shifting, something alive. The surface rippled like liquid silver, as though it was waiting to reflect something back at them. Meredith's voice was quiet but firm. "Step through, and you will find what you seek." The traveler swallowed hard. They glanced back down at the book, the ink still curling across the page. The traveler hesitated at the threshold, knowing that beyond the door lay the truth they had spent lifetimes trying to reclaim. Their hands trembled. They had spent so long searching without knowing what they were looking for. Now, at last, they had an answer. With a deep breath, they stepped forward and touched the door. The world shifted around them. For a brief, breathless moment they felt weightless, suspended between time and memory. Then the ground solidified beneath their feet, and they found themselves standing in a vast, circular hall. Mirrors lined the walls, stretching from floor to ceiling. But these were no ordinary reflections. Within the glass, scenes played out. Flickering images of past travelers stepping through the same door, standing in the same place, asking the same questions. Some turned back, others stepped forward, and in the center of the hall, resting on an ornate pedestal, lay an ancient book. Its pages fluttered despite the still air. The traveler approached slowly, pulse thrumming. They could feel the weight of it even before they touched it, an object of immeasurable significance. When they placed their hands on the cover, the mirrors around them shifted. The flickering images stabilized, revealing a single moment. A person stood beneath the branches of an enormous ancient tree. A storm raged in the distance. Lightning split the sky. The traveler's breath hitched. This was the memory. And the person beneath the tree. It was them. They watched as their past self knelt before the roots of the tree, pressing their hands against the earth. Words formed on their lips, carried away by the wind. A promise. But before they could hear it, the image shattered. The book beneath their hands vibrated. They looked down to see a name forming on the first page. Their name. The truth hit them all at once. They had not simply lost their way. They had given up their name willingly. The traveler stumbled back, the weight of the revelation crushing. They had chosen to forget. Meredith's words echoed in their mind. You must choose differently this time. Their past self had stood beneath that tree, faced with an impossible choice. And whatever they had promised that night had led them here, to the bookshop, to the endless cycle of seeking. But why? Why had they erased their own name? Their hands clenched into fists. The answers were still out of reach, but now, at least, they knew what had been taken from them. No, not taken, given. Their gaze dropped back to the book. The name was still forming, curling across the page in ink that shimmered like starlight. They took a deep breath and reached out, their fingers grazing the letters. And the world shifted again. They were back in the bookshop. The tome lay open on the counter, its final words solidifying. The traveler reclaimed their name, but now they must remember the promise they made. Meredith watched them, her expression unreadable. Well? The traveler let out a breath. Their name hummed in their mind now, no longer lost. They had reclaimed it. But one question still remained. Their voice was steady as they asked, "What did I promise?" Meredith's smile was knowing. She gestured to the book. "That," she said, "is for you to remember." The traveler exhaled. They had found their name. Now they had one final truth left to uncover, and this time they would. Chapter 4. The Promise in the Ink. The traveler stood in Meredith's bookshop, the weight of their reclaimed names settling into their bones. It felt strange, foreign yet familiar, like a melody they had once known but forgotten over time. But the name was only part of the truth. Somewhere, hidden in the corridors of their past, was a promise, a vow whispered beneath an ancient tree, a choice that had set this endless cycle into motion. Meredith watched them from behind the counter, her silver-ringed fingers resting lightly on the surface. Her expression was unreadable, her knowing smile neither reassuring nor ominous. "You found your name," she said at last. "But names are only the beginning. A promise, though." She tapped a finger against the book's cover. "A promise is what binds us." The traveler swallowed. "How do I find it?" Meredith inclined her head toward the book still resting before them. The ink had settled into the final words of the last chapter. The traveler reclaimed their name. But now they must remember the promise they made. The traveler hesitated. In the past, the book had written their path before they had walked it, ink spilling onto the pages in real time. But now it was waiting, silent. No more instructions, no more predetermined steps. For the first time, the book was listening. The traveler reached out, running their fingertips over the parchment. "Do I have to write it myself?" Meredith's smile widened just slightly. "No, you have to remember." The book vibrated beneath their touch, and suddenly the ink bled across the page, forming a single line. Turn the page. A shiver ran down their spine. They inhaled, steadying themselves, and turned the page. The world around them shifted. The bookshop vanished in a swirl of ink and smoke. The scent of parchment and candle wax was replaced by damp earth, the whisper of pages exchanged for the rustling of wind through trees. When the traveler opened their eyes, they were standing beneath the massive, gnarled branches of an ancient tree. Their breath caught. They knew this place. The tree's roots curled and twisted through the soil, massive and unyielding. Its bark was rough, carved with deep grooves and symbols that shimmered faintly, as if they had been scorched into the wood by fire. The traveler stepped forward. Their heartbeat thrummed in their ears. This was the place from their vision in the Hall of Echoes, the place where they had knelt, where they had spoken a vow that had unraveled their very existence. And now it was time to remember. The book was still in their hands, but its pages were blank again, waiting. They knelt, just as they had before. And then the memory came. A storm raged in the distance, thunder rolling across the hills like the growl of some great beast. Rain speckled the earth, turning the soil dark. The traveler, their past self, knelt before the tree, hands pressed into the roots, whispering words that had been lost to time. Lightning split the sky. A voice, deep and ancient, rumbled from the heart of the tree. "You would offer your name?" The past traveler's breath shuddered. "Yes." "You understand the price?" A pause, then quieter. "Yes." "Then it is done." The air crackled, and something unseen shifted. The traveler's past self gasped as a force, like hands unseen, wrapped around their chest, pulling, tugging. Their name, their very identity, being unwoven. The tree's bark glowed with the stolen name, locking it away. And then darkness. The memory shattered. The traveler stumbled back, gasping for air. The ancient tree loomed above them, unchanged, unmoved by the weight of their revelation. They had done this to themselves. They had given up their name, given up who they were, for something. But why? They turned back to the book in their hands, and this time the ink did not wait. A promise was made. A name was given. But what was received? The traveler's hands trembled. What did I trade my name for? The wind stirred through the branches. The air smelled of rain. Then a whisper, not from the book, not from Meredith, from the tree itself. The traveler turned slowly, heart pounding. The deep grooves in the bark, the symbols etched into its flesh, began to shift. The voice that spoke was neither male nor female, neither kind nor cruel. You wished to forget. The traveler's blood ran cold. You wished to be free. They stepped forward, pressing a hand to the bark. The moment their fingers made contact, they saw everything. Flashes of a life before this one. A face they could not name, but knew they had loved. A place lost to time, swallowed by mist and memory. A choice, their choice, to forget it all. Because remembering was too painful. The traveler staggered back, gasping. Their vision blurred, their pulse roaring in their ears. This wasn't just about a name. It was about grief. They had chosen to forget because remembering had been unbearable. A broken promise, a loss too great to carry. They had erased themselves. And now, here they were, standing at the crossroads once more. The book in their hands burned hot, as if urging them forward. They had done this once before, but now they had the chance to do it differently. The tree's voice rumbled again. "Do you wish to remember?" The traveler's throat tightened. Their past self had chosen to forget, but had it freed them? No. It had left them wandering, lost in an endless cycle of seeking answers that had always been within them. They exhaled slowly, and then, "Yes," they whispered, "I want to remember." The tree shifted, the roots trembled, the air crackled, and then a surge of warmth rushing through the traveler's veins. A name, their name, returned in full force, and with it memories. Not all at once, not enough to overwhelm, but enough to know, enough to feel the pain, the love, the truth. They had not simply been lost. They had been running. But now, at last, they were ready to stop. The world around them blurred again. The scent of damp earth faded. The whisper of wind through trees became the quiet hum of candlelight. They opened their eyes. They were back in Meredith's bookshop. The book in their hands had changed. The final words on the last page were no longer a question, no longer a command. They were a statement. The traveler remembered, and this time they did not run. Meredith watched them from behind the counter, her eyes twinkling with something close to pride. "Well?" she asked. The traveler exhaled, their grip on the book steady. "I remember." Meredith smiled. "And?" The traveler looked down at the book, the story of their journey, their choices, their truth. Then, slowly, they closed it. And for the first time in a long, long time, they knew who they were. And that was only the beginning. Chapter 5. The final chapter. The traveler stood in Meredith's midnight bookshop, the weight of their reclaimed name and memories settling deep into their bones. The book in their hands, once a mystery, a guide, a cage, was now simply theirs. The ink had stopped shifting. The story had been written. But for the first time the traveler understood. The book had never dictated their fate. It had only revealed the choices they had already made over and over again across countless cycles. And now, at last, the cycle was broken. Meredith watched them with her usual knowing smile, but there was something softer in her expression now, as if she had been waiting for this moment as long as they had. She tilted her head slightly. "How does it feel?" The traveler ran their fingers over the book's worn cover. "Strange," they admitted. "But right," Meredith nodded. "Then it is done." The traveler frowned. "Is it? Just like that?" Meredith chuckled, the sound warm and familiar, like the turning of pages in a well-loved book. "You tell me." The traveler hesitated. The bookshop had been a place of seeking, of unraveling mysteries, of returning to questions that never had answers. And now the questions had been answered. For the first time since stepping into this place, they knew who they were. They were no longer lost. A thought settled in their mind, quiet, but certain. It was time to leave. The traveler looked toward the door, the same one they had entered through. It was still there, unremarkable and wooden, the outside world waiting just beyond it. But something had changed. They could feel it. This time they would not step out as a weary, wandering traveler. They would step out as themselves. They turned back to Meredith, a sudden wave of gratitude washing over them. "Thank you." She inclined her head, silver hair catching the candlelight. "It was never about finding the answers," she said. "It was about being ready to accept them." The traveler smiled. "I think I understand now." "Good." Meredith's eyes twinkled. "Then you should go." The traveler hesitated only a moment longer, then with steady steps moved toward the door and pushed it open. The scent of autumn air greeted them first, crisp, cold, filled with the promise of change. They stepped through the threshold, expecting, perhaps foolishly, to find the quiet cobbled street where they had first stumbled upon the bookshop. But the street was gone. In its place, a vast forest stretched endlessly before them, the same forest where they had reclaimed their memories, the same forest where the ancient tree stood, guarding the promise they had once made. The traveler turned back toward the bookshop, heart pounding, but the door was gone. Meredith's bookshop had vanished as if it had never been there at all. The traveler exhaled, closing their eyes. They weren't afraid. For the first time, they weren't afraid. They took a step forward, then another, boots pressing into the damp earth. They could feel the name they had reclaimed humming beneath their skin, could feel the weight of memory settling into place, not as a burden, but as a part of them. Ahead, through the dense forest, a glow flickered. Not like the soft lanterns of the bookshop, not like the shifting ink on the pages. This light was different, warmer, stronger. It called to them, not with whispered riddles, not with mysterious pages written in real time, but with possibility, with a future. The traveler took a deep breath, then walked toward the light, and for the first time in a long, long time, they were finally moving forward. Far away in a place that existed only when it was needed, a bookshop stood beneath the glow of the midnight moon. Inside, Meredith turned a single page in a new book. Its cover was dark, its pages crisp and unwritten. The ink curled and stretched across the parchment, forming the title of the next story. A new name, a new traveler. The cycle continued, but this time the story would be different.